So one of the things that I think we've noticed, Ajahn and I can both attest to this when we've noticed about being in Chicago, particularly on the roads, is that there's a significant amount of road rage out there in Chicago. People seem very upset and angry on the roads, and they're very prone to honking their horns at the drop of a hat, if you will, it seems like very superfluous reasons, unnecessarily, if you will. But it feels good, right? Someone cuts you off in the middle of traffic, and you have no words to say. All this anger boils up inside of you, and the only thing that you can do is smash that horn as hard as you can, because you're imagining that's probably that guy's face right now. And you're hitting the horn as hard as you can, and you just imagine all these things that are going through your mind because you're justified. You're justified. He cut you off in traffic, or maybe, it kind of relates to a different statistic I heard, that there are pretty much as many, or maybe even more, lawyers in this country than there are doctors, which kind of shows something about our society, that this country is so litigious, that we're so easy to sue anybody. I think we were, during caroling yesterday, we joked around about how if there's ice someplace, and if you slip somewhere, just be careful, because then you can sue the owner of the apartment complex or whatever for slipping in the ice. Or we're looking for all these other, we're trying to protect ourselves because we're so afraid of getting sued by other people. That was a conversation that came up earlier about putting salt outside. Not because we want to make sure no one slips, God forbid, but because we're like, if someone slips, they might sue us. So we should make sure that we put some salt out there outside so that no one sues us. Not so they don't get hurt, just so they don't sue us. If we knew they weren't going to sue us, then we probably wouldn't put salt out there in the first place. But why is that? Why are we in such a society that seems so easy to react that way? So easy to file a lawsuit when so many things are avoidable just by open communication, just by talking to each other. And we can avoid so many controversies. Joseph here is actually not doing anything wrong. The first thought in his mind, because you have to kind of imagine the situation, right? He's this older gentleman. In the Orthodox tradition, Joseph is actually a widower, and he's been placed in charge of Mary by the temple priest, because Mary is much younger now at this time, and so she grew up in the temple, and she was put. And when she became a certain age, it became no longer appropriate for her to live in the temple. So the temple priest, Zachariah being her uncle, looking around for a just man who might be able to look after her. And they found this person, Joseph, who happened to be a widower. And so they said, okay, we'll betroth her to Joseph because he's a good man, he's righteous, and he'll take care of her. That's kind of the idea. So, which is what happened. But lo and behold, here's Joseph, this very just man, very righteous before the Lord. All of a sudden, this woman that he's betrothed to ends up being pregnant. And of course, he's thinking in his mind, I just got finagled. I just got, right? They played me, if you will. And but in his mind, he has a lot of justifiable actions he can do. He can divorce her. If he wanted to, he can make her a public example. It says here he didn't want to do that, but he had every right to. What happens to a woman in those days who's made a public example for adultery? What happens to a woman in those days? She's stoned to death, right? He had every right to. He was justified under Jewish law to go put her in front of all the people and say, look at this woman. She's betrothed to me, but somehow she ended up with a child. As he's every right to do that. Jewish law allows him to do that. Jewish law allowed him to divorce her too. Allowed him to divorce her. And he was thinking about that, I'm going to do this very quietly so it doesn't make a scene, and we'll just kind of forget this ever happened. Then of course he's visited by the angel of the Lord. The Lord visits him and says, look, not only are you not going to make her a public example, not only are you not going to divorce her, but in fact you are going to take her as your wife. You are going to continue being betrothed to her. You are going to be, continue that charge that was placed in your hands. That was the more righteous thing to do. There's something that he had the perfect right to do something. He had the right to divorce her. He had the right to make a public example of her, but that isn't necessarily the right thing to do. And that's a very fine line that we have to distinguish in our lives. What do we have the right to do? You have the right to do anything you want. You have the right to say whatever you want to say to anybody. You have the right to do anything to anybody as long as you don't infringe upon their rights. We're all guaranteed that, right? We live in a free country. I can do whatever I want to do. But just because we have the right to do something doesn't make it the right thing to do. Does that make sense? There's a distinction there. Just because I have the right to do something doesn't make it the right thing to do. But the problem is we live in a society that looks at what are my rights, and I'm going to exercise my rights as much as possible, forgetting about how that affects the other person. Because I worship my rights. My rights are sacred to me. If someone cuts me off in traffic, I'm going to honk my horn, I'm going to tailgate them, I'm going to follow them. If someone hits me or if I slip and fall somewhere, I'm going to sue them. We live in a culture that looks for the lawyer, your lawyer's business card first, before calling 911 for help, or before making sure someone's okay. We make sure that the lawyer's number is securely in our pockets or in our phone books. Because we live in a society that looks at how can I gain the upper hand. But that's not what we're taught here. That's not what the gospel reading is about. And that's not what this season is about. Not about who can gain the upper hand. Not how many arguments I can win on technicalities. Not how many arguments I can win by being the loudest voice in the room. Not by exercising my rights, but by looking at what is the right thing to do. And that is a much more difficult line that we have to walk. It's not easy. Joseph definitely was not doing the easy thing. The easy thing would have been to just forget about Mary, divorce her quietly, and just kind of go on with his life. He was fine. Nothing would have happened to him. He would just continue on his life. But then what about her situation? She's this young girl who is now pregnant. In that society, she probably wouldn't last very long. So he had every right to leave her, but the right thing to do was to stay and to carry on that responsibility and the charge that he was given. And so many times we have to look at our lives and wonder, what's the right thing to do? The right thing isn't always easy. And the right thing isn't always pleasing to you, pleasing to me. But a lot of times the right thing helps other people, and that's what mends those fences. That's what kind of mends those bridges. Because we're all built on relationships. And a lot of times whenever we exercise our personal rights, we trample on those relationships. Those relationships don't mean anything unless you can hold something up in a court of law. But the right thing to do is to mend that relationship. And that's what we work on during this season. The Christmas season, as we prepare ourselves for the advent of Christ, you can't say, I have Christ in my heart when you're ready to sue somebody over slipping and falling. You can't say, I have Christ in my heart when you have hatred for your brother or your sister. There's no room for Christ in our hearts if all we have is hate, if all we have is dislike. And so during this season, if we're supposed to welcome Christ into our hearts and welcome Christ into our homes, then we have to make sure that there's room in our hearts and our homes for Christ to dwell. Not room full of hate, not room full of despair, not of ignoring one another, but of actual love, of mending relationships, of building bridges, and making sure that the first call isn't to figure out how can I win this argument, how can I trap this other person, how can I show this other person that I'm better than them and that I'm stepping all over them. Rather, how can I win my brother back? How can I win my sister back? How can I get a new friend? And that's the idea of during this Christmas season. Let us continue and pray that Christ finds an acceptable dwelling place in our hearts and our homes, a place that is full of love. Because whatever is in our hearts and our homes, Christ will only magnify that. He magnifies whatever is already there. All praise and thanksgiving be to the blessed Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one true God, forever and ever.